Greetings and welcome back to Room 303, AP English and our World of Ideas lectures. This is number 15, Marx's The Communist Manifesto of 1848. Now, we have said already in 303 a number of times that if one wants to study the ideas of the 20th and the 21st century, there are three or yea four writers that we probably do need to spend a bit of time with. As we have said, Darwin, of course, his view that all of life is biological struggle. Marx, who comes along and says far more important than simply biological struggle is the struggle of finances, economics, and class as it relates to the notion of power and the state. Freud comes along as the third of our big three, as we've sometimes referred to him, and says, it may be true that life is about biological struggle and class struggle, but way more influential is the struggle of the mind, the psychic struggle. And then if you want to add a fourth there, Nietzsche, who in some ways is almost like the synthesizer of all of those and the great critiquer because of his ability to talk about interpretation and hermeneutics. Here in the Jacobus text, we'll read all four of these important thinkers. Now we pick up our Marx, so controversial, so critical, and yet we will say out loud, we're not going to be afraid of an idea or an individual who espouses ideas, although no question the controversy that still remains around Marx and the views of Marx and Marxism has created a lot of conflict, no question, and continues to do so. Now, some agree that Marx's whole notion of how to run the world is proven wrong, dead wrong, by the revolutions of the 20th century, especially the Russian and the Chinese revolutions. The question that often follows that is something like this. Was it the fault of Marx's ideology, his philosophy, his theories, his ideas, or rather was it a faulty application? That is to say, one can still take the Marxist ideas and apply them in some healthy way. We're going to leave a lot of this up to you, although we will point out that if you pick up a work like Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago, we're going to get an argument there that says fundamentally Marxism will fail every time. Some of you have been following the work. I know that you've spoken of it with me, of Jordan Peterson's work. Maps of Meaning comes to mind here, and as well as online conversations, as absolute proof for Peterson that Marxism just cannot work at all. Now, these are powerful critiques of the Marxist ideology. Here's the point I want to make. You can't talk really legitimately about Marx until you've read Marx. And so let's go ahead now and pay attention to Communist Manifesto and just see what we can learn, right? We want to actually read and annotate the text and then make our own decisions. We're not going to be afraid to critique the text either, okay? An informed decision, we might say. Now, as we always do at the beginning of these lectures, we'll begin with our assumptions. And of course, the first is that you've been following our stuff at LearnStrong.net, the World of Ideas lectures 1 through 14, and as well our earlier lectures in AP. You can find all of that in the AP folder. Our other assumptions are that you understand our learning theory, that notion that we're trying to connect new information to old information in meaningful ways. That'll be really important in a discussion like this, as well as, of course, our annotative approach, where we're going to be doing some paragraph outlining. Now, we're going to do that in Communist Manifesto, but because there's so many paragraphs, I'm going to recommend that you probably will group some of those paragraphs together and make them a little bit more easy, and I'll do that myself at level 1. At level 2, of course, we're asking how can I understand this in terms of, you know, what does this text mean? At 2A, themes, messages, as well as our big 5. What does this text say about epistemology, what you can know, ontology, who we are, psychology, the study of the individual mind, sociology, this will be a big one for this study, the notion of the group, and then finally theodicy, the question of evil in the universe and pain and suffering, and what does this text say about all of those? Finally, at 2B, we'll be working with how we study the rhetorical techniques that are utilized. And then at level 3, we ask, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, other texts that we know of. And then finally, 3B, our own personal opinions. And this will be the key, I think, for us. You want to be informed, and then you want to have a mind that is capable of seeing multiple perspectives, that is to say educated, right, as we have talked about it in 303. And then you can make up your own mind so that, for example, if you hear someone speak of Marxism or socialism, you'll at least have a point of reference. That's what this discussion is all about. We're not going to get into the weeds, and we certainly aren't going to make powerful arguments one way or the other for or against Marxism. What we'll be doing is looking at the text itself and then asking what you think, right? Now here, biography matters, no question, so let's do a brief biography. By the way, just to point out, we're working with the Samuel Moore translation, and also in our reading from Jacobus, part 3 of the Communist Manifesto, socialist and communist literature is omitted, okay? So we want to make that clear right from the very beginning. Of course, you can find the rest of the Communist Manifesto, I hope that you will, in your own study online. Let's do a brief bio here. Marx's dates, 1818 to 1883. He is born to German Jewish parents. They convert to Lutheranism. There's a lot of biographers of Marx that point out that's an important moment in his life. He is a brilliant, brilliant scholar. He studied literature and philosophy, took his PhD from the University of Jena. He's denied a university position and then turns to journalism. Some have argued that if he had just been given the position of a prof, he would have probably never have become the voice for his view that he became. His political views were controversial. He's exiled first to Paris, then to Brussels, finally to London. He lived in absolute poverty in London, and that is a key, so we want to write that down. Marx knew what it was like to live with very little financially and the expectation of even less. His friend, Friedrich Engels, and of course Engels, 1820 to 1895, will support in large measure Marx, financially and of course emotively as well. And it is while he's living in London that Marx begins to write his most famous books. He will as well contribute over 300 articles to the New York Daily Tribune, and yet he's best known, of course, for his socialism as it's delivered in the Communist Manifesto of 1848. He does write this with Engels' help. He publishes Das Kapital in 1867 and will die in 1883 before being famous, and that's central as well. It's always been a debate what Marx would have had to say about the way history played out his ideologies. Debates going in both directions, that he would be pleased with what happened or he would be very unhappy. Now his influences are prodigious, no question about it. Just to mention one, obviously, Lenin, 1870 to 1924, and the Russian Revolution of 1917, prodigious, and of course we think of Mao Zedong and the Chinese Revolution as well. The beginning of the tension in many ways is understood in Marx between what we will call capitalism and socialism. I'll just work with what Jacobus has to say on page 210 and the last couple of paragraphs. In England, Marx's studies centered on the concept of an ongoing class struggle between those who own property, what he called the bourgeoisie, and those who own nothing but whose work produced wealth, the proletariat. Marx was concerned with the forces of history, and his view of history was that it is progressive and to an extent inevitable, very much similar to the views of Hegel, as we talked about it. This view is prominent in the Communist Manifesto, particularly in Marx's review of the overthrow of feudal forms of government by the bourgeoisie. He thought it inevitable that the bourgeoisie and the proletariat would engage in class struggle from which the proletariat would emerge victorious. In essence, Marx took a materialistic position. You want to put that in your notes. He denied the providence of God in the affairs of humans and defended the view that economic institutions evolved naturally and that in their evolution they controlled the social order. He called religion the opiate of the masses. Thus, communism was an inevitable part of the process, and in the manifesto he worked to clarify the reasons for its inevitability. Now, epistemologically, we may call this the absolutist position. We'll get into it in a while. One of Marx's primary contentions was that capital is not a personal, it is a social power. Okay, we're going to see that in paragraph 78. Thus, according to Marx, the past dominates the present, paragraph 83, since the accumulation of past capital determines how people will live in the present society. Capitalist economists, however, see capital as a personal power, but a power that, as John Kenneth Galbraith, who we'll read in our next essay, might say, should be used in a socially responsible way. Okay? So now let's turn to notions of rhetoric, Marxist rhetoric. He's going to primarily work with comparisons. He's going to carefully try to define terms. His style will be very simple and direct. Students who have never read Marx are kind of shocked when they pick him up and they start reading him. They're like, This is actually not that difficult for me to read, as opposed to, for example, the Wealth of Nations, the Smith's Wealth of Nations that we were working with in our previous discussion. In paragraphs number 60 through 133, we have these proletarians and communists, where very clever rhetorical strategy. Let's just read Jacobus. I'm on 211. Marx assumes he's addressed by an antagonist, presumably a bourgeoisie or a proletariat, who is in sympathy with the bourgeoisie. He then proceeds to answer each popular complaint against communism, not unlike what King does at the very beginning of a letter from a Birmingham jail. You'll go back rhetorically and take a look at that. He shows that it's not a party separate from other workers' parties, paragraph 61. He clarifies the question of abolishing existing property relations, paragraph 68 to 93. He emphasizes the antagonism between capital and wage labor, paragraph 76. He discusses the disappearance of culture, paragraph 94. He clarifies the questions of the family, paragraphs 98 through 100. It's one of the more controversial of Communist Manifesto. We'll get to it. And of the exploitation of children, paragraph 101. He brings up the new system of public education, paragraphs 102 to 204. He raises the touchy issue of the community of women, paragraphs 105 to 110, as well as the charge that communists want to abolish nations, paragraphs 111 to 115. He brushes aside religion, paragraph 116. When he is done with the complaints, he gives us a rhetorical signal, quote, "But let us have done with the bourgeois objections to communism," paragraph 126. Okay. Then, of course, the rest of the second section will be this brief summary, his 10-point program of paragraph 131, and then the last section, paragraphs 135 to 145, he compares the communists with other reform groups. And in short, he will say the communists everywhere support every revolutionary movement against the existing social and political order of things, paragraph 141. Very plain, very direct style. Okay. So let's go ahead now and turn to this text. By the way, we will, of course, in our study, need to return back to the Arndt essay on page 83, Ideology and Terror, no question. And I actually, before we begin this, I want to go back to page 29 of World of Ideas. And, I'm sorry, to passage 29 of World of Ideas on page 21. This is Lao Tzu. And I think it's significant when we pick up Plato's Republic, as we have already talked about it, learnstrong.net, you can see those lectures, or Marx here, or Machiavelli's Prince. Lao Tzu says it this way in the 29th passage. Do you want to improve the world? I don't think it can be done. The world is sacred. It can't be improved. If you tamper with it, you'll ruin it. If you treat it like an object, you'll lose it. There is a time for being ahead, a time for being behind, a time for being in motion, a time for being at rest, a time for being vigorous, a time for being exhausted, a time for being safe, a time for being in danger, sounding very much like the book of Ecclesiastes in the Old Testament. The master, the ruler, sees things as they are without trying to control them. She lets them go their own way and resides at the center of the circle. Now, of course, we've already given a lecture on Lao Tzu and his philosophy regarding government and leadership. We now turn to this text, the Communist Manifesto, and let's pay attention to it. I wish, two observations. I wish I could just read the whole thing and just work through it line by line. I just don't have time, guys, and I'm sorry for that. I'll summarize, though, sections of this and paragraph sections taken collectively. The other comment I would make is you need to pay attention in the Jacobus volume to the notes at the bottom, especially as they relate to events in history. The text opens, a specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this specter. Well, what's going on here? The specter of communism, he says in paragraphs 1 through 6. The specter of communism haunts Europe, whose powers have allied to oppose it. Every opposition party, advanced or reactionary, is labeled communistic. Therefore, communists of various nationalities have gathered to publish their views and goal. The universality of Communist Manifesto is one of the things that has been commented on over the years about this text, so that you could have any number of peoples who would pick this text up and feel somehow they can identify with it. Paragraph 7 through 11, the history of society is a history of class struggles. In our own epoch, society is more and more splitting into two great hostile classes, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. This dualism is central to studying Marxian philosophy. And it obviously begs the question about assumptions. Why has it got to be two? Why can't it be more than two? Obviously, it will take us back to the notions of Aristotelian views, as we've talked about it, of a tripartite view of society, with the upper class, the lower class, and the middle class, and all of that. Paragraphs 12 through 22, the bourgeoisie sprang from burghers, became merchants, this is the history part of the essay, and grew into the present industrial middle class. Modern industry has established the world market, causing commerce and navigation to burgeon. Meanwhile, the bourgeoisie has swamped all other classes. It's replaced old ties and values, veiled exploitation, with the naked exploitation of treating everything as a cash transaction, the cash nexus as it sometimes is referred to. Paragraph 23 through 26. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production and thereby the relations of production, and with them, the whole relations of society. In its rush to achieve, it's generated constant uncertainty and agitation. It has superseded local patterns of production and consumption with multinational industries and markets, creating new wants and dependencies among consumers. Paragraphs 27 through 30. By improving the means of production and communication, the bourgeoisie has forced the world into its own mold. It's subjected the country to the towns and undeveloped nations to civilized ones. It has centralized population, production, and property control, as well as stimulated enormous technological change. This is Marx's view that it's a dynamic moment in history that's about to unfold. Paragraphs 31 through 34. Although built on a feudal foundation, the bourgeoisie's development of productive forces burst the fetters of feudal property relations. It stepped free competition with accompanying social and political adaptations. But the productive forces have grown too strong, and this is the central argument, too strong for bourgeoisie's control and create a periodic chaos of overproduction that endangers bourgeoisie's property and society. The bourgeoisie fights back with greater market exploitation, paving the way for worse crises and its own eventual ruin. This will be a central notion of Marx, as he has an evolutionary notion of what's coming. Okay. Paragraphs 35 through 38. The bourgeoisie has not only forged the weapons of its destruction, but called into existence those who are to wield them, the proletariat. This will be the ironic part of the Manifesto. The proletariat, now to define. The proletariat is a class of laborers who live only as long as they find work, and who find work only as long as their labor increases capital. Like all commodities, they're subject to market fluctuations. They function as appendages of machines, slaves of the bourgeoisie class and state, doing simple, monotonous tasks. And of course, as we've said, Marx himself understood some of this firsthand experiences. Paragraphs 39 through 46. He says, old workers, children, women, small tradespeople, and those with specialized skills all sink into the proletariat. Their initial struggle with the bourgeoisie is individual and local. Workers attack the instruments rather than the conditions of production, seeking to restore their feudal status. As the proletariat becomes concentrated and aware of its commonality, workers form broader geographic unions in which lie their ultimate strength. And we kind of begin then to get some sense of really the direction that Marx is going. It's taken him a while to get there. I'll just read the line from paragraph 45. He says it this way: every class struggle is a political struggle. And so for Marx, everything comes back to class, everything comes back to this understanding of economics and power. Paragraphs 47 to 55. The bourgeoisie, embattled on numerous fronts, needs help from the proletariat and therefore gives workers weapons against itself. Sections of the ruling class also fall or jump into the proletariat. Unlike all previous classes, the proletarians have nothing of their own to fortify. Their mission is to destroy the existing system of individual property. Unlike all previous historical movements, theirs is not a minority, but a majority upheaval. Let's just read paragraph 51, because this gives you a sense of the radical idea that Marx is playing with. He says it this way: the lower middle class, the small manufacturer, the shopkeeper, the artisan, the peasant, All these fight against the bourgeoisie to save from extinction their existence as functions of the middle class. They are therefore not revolutionary, but conservative. Nay more, they are reactionary, for they try to roll back the wheel of history. If by chance they are revolutionary, they are so only in view of their impending transfer into the proletariat. They thus defend not their present, but their future interests. They desert their own standpoint to place themselves at that of the proletariat. The paragraphs now 56 to 59. The proletarian bourgeoisie struggle is national at first. It begins as a veiled civil war and then breaks out into a revolution and the proletariat's violent overthrow of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie is unfit to rule because it cannot even ensure its slaves' existence within their slavery, but lets their situation degenerate to where it must feed them. As industry ends laborers' isolation and competition with each other, the fall of the bourgeoisie and the victory of the proletariat are inevitable. And it's certainly starting in these paragraphs that we begin to see the ideologies and the optimism, the utopian optimism of Marx. Paragraphs 60 through 93. The communists are not separate from or opposed to other working class parties, but work on behalf of the proletariat worldwide. They favor the overthrow of the bourgeoisie and the abolition of private property. This will be a central notion, right? Ending the dominance of capital and enriching the life of the worker, what sometimes has later been referred to as wealth distribution or redistribution of wealth. They do not aim to sweep away freedom and individuality. This will be one of the ironies given the way that Marxist revolutions played out, right? Only the bourgeoisie and their system of buying and selling. Paragraphs 94 to 110, as we begin to finish now the Manifesto. Bourgeoisie culture, laws, institutions, like bourgeoisie productivity, exist only to benefit the ruling class. This will be one of the big arguments, of course, that Smith will make counter, right? The exploitive bourgeoisie family will vanish, along with wage labor when capital